The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long bands of gold across the training camp that sat on the edge of the wildlife reserve. The air was thick with the scent of dust and dew, and somewhere in the distance, a bird of prey called out, echoing through the open field. The cadets were already awake, their boots crunching on gravel as they lined up near the main enclosure, hearts beating fast beneath crisp khaki shirts. Some of them whispered nervously, others stood stiff and silent, their eyes fixed on the tall steel gates ahead, where their first close encounter with a real predator would take place. Today was the kind of morning that demanded attention. Every sound seemed sharper, every breath felt heavier. The instructors stood nearby with clipboards in hand, watching the young trainees carefully as they checked the equipment ropes, tranquilizer poles and radios. None of them wanted to be the one who made a mistake today, because inside that enclosure waited the star of the training camp, a young predator cub with a reputation for unpredictability. The cub had been rescued months ago, found alone near the northern ridge of the reserve. Its mother had vanished, leaving it to fend for itself. The team had brought it here to be studied, trained, and eventually released back into the wild, but so far the cub had resisted every attempt to tame its wild heart. It was strong, quick, and fiercely intelligent. Its golden fur shone like fire under sunlight, and its amber eyes carried a spark of defiance that made even the most experienced handlers cautious. The cadets had heard stories of the cub, of how it once snarled at a senior handler and refused food for 2 days, until it was left alone, of how it would pace in circles, growling under its breath whenever strangers came too close. The tales had grown into legend among the trainees, and now standing in front of the enclosure, they could feel the weight of that reputation pressing on their nerves. Arya stood near the middle of the group, her cap pulled low over her brow, her gaze fixed on the gates. Unlike the others, she wasn't fidgeting or whispering. She simply watched, listening to the soft hum of the camp, the sound of wind brushing through dry grass, and the distant thump of the cub's paws as it moved inside the enclosure. Arya had grown up around animals back on her family's farm. She'd seen calves born, and wild dogs tamed with patience and calm. She believed no creature was born cruel, only scared and misunderstood. The instructor called out a few last words of warning, reminding them that predators could sense fear, that they must move slowly and avoid direct eye contact. The cadets nodded in silence, but Arya barely heard him. Her thoughts were on the creature inside, on what it must feel like to be trapped behind those bars, surrounded by strange scents and louder heartbeats. The sun climbed higher, the metallic groan of the gate cut through the still air, the enclosure door slid open. With a slow, heavy sound, the cadets straightened their backs, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Beyond the gate, the cub moved into view, its fur glinting gold in the light, its body low and powerful, its gaze sharp as it scanned the humans before it, and in that moment the camp seemed to hold its breath as the wild met the waiting. The cub stepped into the open enclosure, its paws pressing softly against the sand, its muscles rippling beneath the short golden fur, every movement silent but deliberate. The air itself seemed to change. As it appeared, a heavy mix of awe and tension settled over the cadets. The young predator was smaller than they had imagined, but its presence filled the space with something ancient and powerful, something that demanded respect and quiet attention. The sunlight touched its coat, turning each hair into a thread of gold and bronze. Its eyes gleamed with a feral brightness, scanning every face beyond the fence. Its tail flicked once, twice, a warning, a sign of unease. The cub was not used to so many eyes staring it down. It was a creature of instinct, born to roam and hunt, not to be surrounded by humans and their nervous chatter. The cadets stood frozen, unsure whether to admire or to fear what stood before them. One of the instructors, a tall man with a weathered face, spoke in a low voice, reminding them to stay calm, to breathe slow, to let the animal get used to their presence. His tone was steady, but even he kept a cautious distance. The cub's ears twitched. At every sound, every movement, its growl deepened for a moment, a low vibration that rumbled in its chest like distant thunder. The cadets exchanged glances, some swallowed hard, others stepped back. A few whispered that maybe the creature should still be in the wild, not here, under their watch. But Arya did not move. She stood near the center, her eyes fixed on the cub, her breathing steady, her mind quiet. She had seen that look before, not in predators, but in frightened horses and cornered dogs. It was the look of something unsure, not evil, not angry, just afraid. She knew fear could wear many masks, and this one growled instead of trembling. She felt the pull of something unspoken, an invisible thread that tied her curiosity to the animal before The cub tilted its head slightly, catching her scent, its nose flaring as it studied her different from the others. She did not smell of fear or hesitation, she smelled of calm soil and grass and sunlight. Her stillness confused it, the others shifted their weight nervously, but she remained unmoving, and that made the cub pause. Its tail stopped flicking, its growl faded into a soft huff that puffed a small cloud of dust between them. The instructor noticed the shift, his eyes narrowed in cautious approval. He whispered to another cadet to note the reaction. This was valuable behavior, insight, the kind of moment that could not be staged, but Arya barely heard him. Her world had narrowed to the space between her and the cub, a space alive with trust and testing energy. The cub crouched low again, its muscles tense, ready to spring, but not out of aggression, rather curiosity, a wild child testing boundaries. A gust of wind carried the scent of the humans across the pen. The cub blinked and took a slow step forward, one paw pressing into the soft dirt, its gaze still locked on Arya. The rest of the cadets instinctively leaned back, their hearts racing, but she stayed where she was, unshaken. The cub's growl returned, faint but uncertain, and she felt the tremor in her chest, not of fear but of recognition. It was the sound of nature speaking in its truest form. Untamed, unbroken, alive. Instructor signaled for everyone to remain still, but the cub ignored them all. It focused only on Arya, its eyes bright with challenge and curiosity, its body coiled like a spring, and in that suspended moment, the line between human and predator blurred, as the wild looked into the eyes of the calm and found no threat. Arya felt the weight of every gaze behind her, the quiet breaths of her fellow cadets, the steady hum of tension that hung over the training ground. Yet in her mind, there was only the cub, its amber eyes reflecting the morning light with a strange mix of challenge and innocence. It moved like a ripple through water, smooth, silent, and deliberate, every step, measured every breath, a soft echo of its wild heart. She could see the rise and fall of its chest, the faint quiver of whiskers, the flicker of doubt in its stare, and she understood that this was no act of hostility. It was communication. The instructor's voice came faint from behind, reminding everyone to stay calm, to remember their training, to make no sudden moves. But his words faded into the background of Arya's awareness, her focus held only by the animal before her, a creature that did not speak but said everything through motion and silence. She felt a strange calm spreading through her, a memory perhaps of her childhood, when she would sit among the farm animals, letting them approach her on their own terms. Never forcing, never fearing, always patient, always still. The cub let out a small sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, something uncertain. It paced in a small circle, its tail twitching and its ears turning like tiny radar dishes, catching every sound around it, but its eyes never left hers. Its movements were both cautious and curious, the wild instincts within it battling the newness of human presence. Arya shifted slightly, lowering her stance, not enough to threaten or to retreat, but enough to mirror the cub's posture, a small gesture of understanding that seemed to reach the creature more than any words ever could. The cadets behind her exchanged whispers, their voices filled with disbelief. They had all expected the cub to lunge or retreat, yet neither happened. It was as if the moment had frozen in delicate balance, the kind of fragile peace that could shatter with one wrong breath. Arya's fingers twitched, but she resisted the urge to move. She knew the language of patience, the way animals measured time not in seconds but in trust earned. Slowly, heartbeat by heartbeat, a faint breeze swept across the camp, carrying the scent of dry grass and warm earth. The cub lifted its nose to the wind, then looked back at Arya as if reading something invisible in the air between them. She held its gaze, steady her expression, calm her mind open. She thought about how fear was a mirror that animals often reflected back at you, and how courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stay anyway. The instructor took a slow step forward, his boots crunching softly on gravel, his face unreadable. He was testing to see how the cub would react, but the cub ignored him. It stayed focused on Arya, watching her with a mix of confusion and recognition, as if sensing that she did not see it as an enemy but as something lost in searching. Time stretched thin, the camp held its breath, and in that stillness Arya smiled, just slightly, not enough to show teeth, only a soft curve that spoke of calm. The cub blinked once, then twice, its body easing, its tail lowering, its ears flicking back to a relaxed angle. Something had shifted, an invisible barrier had thinned, and though no one spoke, every cadet there knew they were witnessing something rare. A quiet exchange between human and wild that no amount of training could ever teach. The air was heavy with silence, every breath drawn by the cadets felt too loud, too human, too fragile, for what was unfolding before them. The cub took another step, its paws leaving soft impressions in the dirt, its body low, its tail moving in slow arcs, behind it each motion deliberate, graceful like a whisper from the wild. The sunlight caught its fur, turning gold into fire, and for a moment it looked less like a threat and more like a piece of the untamed world brought to life. Arya did not move. Her eyes stayed on the cub, calm and steady. Her knees bent slightly as she adjusted her balance, the movement so slow it could barely be seen. Her body spoke in a language older than words, one of quiet respect and patience. The cub stopped again, its ears twitching, its nostrils flaring as it drew. In her scent there was no fear, there only curiosity, and something that almost resembled recognition. The cub's growl deepened for a heartbeat, but it was softer now, less of a warning, more of a test. Behind her, the cadets whispered to each other, their voices trembling in disbelief. None of them had ever seen an encounter like this. Their training told them to be cautious, to avoid eye contact, to stay back. Yet here was Arya holding the gaze of a predator, as if she were speaking directly to its soul. Even the instructor stood, frozen, his clipboard forgotten in his hand. The rules of behavior, the checklists, the commands, all seemed to vanish, replaced by raw instinct and awe. The cub began to circle her, slow, deliberate steps, kicking up faint clouds of dust, each step closer, its body brushing the air around her like a question waiting for an answer. Arya turned, slightly following its movement. Without shifting her feet, she moved only with her head and shoulders, letting the cub know she saw it, that she understood its dance. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but her breathing stayed. Even her heart was steady, because she knew that fear was contagious and calm could be too. The world around them faded. The murmurs of the cadets, the rustle of trees, the hum of the camp, all became distant. The only sound was the soft padding of the cub's paws, and the rhythmic inhale and exhale of Arya's breath. The two stood, suspended in a moment that defied logic, a moment where trust was being built without words, without promises, only energy and quiet acceptance. The cub stopped directly in front of her, its head tilted slightly, its eyes glinting with curiosity, its growl gone, now replaced by silence. It took one step closer, and Arya could see the details of its face, the tiny scars along its muzzle, the faint dust along its whiskers. It was a living contradiction of danger and innocence, the embodiment of something pure and untamed. Arya slowly crouched lower, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her gaze still soft. The cub lowered its head, mirroring her. It was subtle but unmistakable, the universal sign of peace between two beings who had chosen not to fight. The cadets behind them held their breath, afraid even to blink and break the spell that had fallen over the camp. Then, for the first time, the cub made a sound, a low huff. Not a growl, not a snarl, but something closer to curiosity. It blinked, and the world seemed to breathe again. The instructor's eyes widened. The cadets exhaled in relief and astonishment, and Arya remained still, a quiet smile forming in her eyes, because she knew this was not the end but only the beginning of a fragile understanding between the wild and the willing. The moment held by glass, fragile and clear. The cub stood only a few steps from Arya, its breath rising in small clouds of warmth. The camp was utterly silent, no sound from the wind, no shuffle from the cadets, not even a cough. The instructor lowered his voice, telling the group to stay completely still, his hand raised slightly in warning, but his eyes were fixed on Arya, a mix of disbelief and admiration flickering across his face. The scene before him broke every rule, yet it felt too pure to interrupt. Arya could feel the tension in the air pressing against her skin. It was not fear but awareness, every nerve alive, every heartbeat deliberate. She had never been this close to a creature so wild, yet she felt no urge to retreat. The cub's eyes were deep like molten amber, and within them she saw something unexpected: confusion, curiosity, maybe even longing. It shifted its weight from paw to paw, its claws pressing faint marks into the dirt, a silent rhythm of indecision. She kept her breathing slow, calm, steady. She could sense the animal studying her as carefully as she studied it. Then the cub made a low rumbling sound in its throat, a growl that vibrated through the air, but there was no threat in it. It was more like a question, as if asking what she was doing there, who she was, what she wanted. Arya answered the only way she knew how, with stillness. Her voice remained inside her, unspoken, but her energy spoke louder than any words could. She met the cub's gaze unflinching, and tilted her head slightly, mimicking its movement. It blinked, surprised, and took a half step back. Its ears flicked forward and back again, torn between instinct and intrigue. The Cadets behind her were holding their breath so long that one of them nearly stumbled, trying not to exhale. The instructor shot him a sharp glance, and silence returned. The cub took another step forward, testing its courage. Arya slowly raised one hand, not to reach but to mirror it, her fingers barely lifted off her knee. A gesture of openness, not demand. The cub's eyes darted to her hand, then back to her face, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of human skin, and something else, something familiar, calm, steady like the earth after rain. A gust of warm air drifted through the pen, carrying the faint smell of the dry grass and distant campfire smoke. The cub turned its head, briefly sniffing the wind, then looked back at her. Its tail flicked once, and it gave a small chuffing sound, soft and uncertain, the kind of noise a cub makes when trying to understand something new. Arya's lips curved slightly, not a smile, just enough warmth to show peace. The animal tilted its head, mirroring her again, and for the first time since the encounter began, the instructor's posture eased. The cub stepped closer, now close enough that Arya could see the rise of its fur. As it breathed, she stayed perfectly still, her heart pounding but her mind clear. The cub's paw brushed the dirt near her boot. It stared at her with that wild intensity that seemed to strip away every barrier between species. Then it let out another sound, softer, this time like a sigh, and sat down. Its body relaxed, its tail curling around its paws, and just like that the storm of tension began to fade. The cadets exchanged wide-eyed looks. None of them dared to speak. They had trained for months to learn the language of dominance and command, but what they had just witnessed was something entirely different. It was connection, raw and unguarded. The instructor exhaled, slowly shaking his head, and muttered under his breath that sometimes rules were written by those who had never met the wild at all. And Arya remained there, unmoving, her eyes still locked with the cub's. As the morning sun climbed higher, and the camp dared to breathe again, the cub's amber eyes flickered in the sunlight. Soft, now no longer sharp with suspicion, it watched Arya with a strange fascination, its head tilted slightly, its body language loose, no longer defensive but curious. The camp was wrapped in silence, thick and almost sacred. Even the winds seemed to pause around them, dust motes floating lazily in the golden air, as if afraid to disturb what was unfolding. Arya's pulse beat in her ears, steady but strong. She could feel the weight of every heartbeat echoing through the ground between her and the cub, like an invisible bridge of rhythm and trust. She slowly leaned forward, her knees pressing into the warm sand, her gaze gentle, never challenging. She lowered her head slightly, a sign of peace, a gesture she had learned long ago when calming frightened horses back on her family farm. The cub mirrored her movement, lowering its head in response, its whiskers twitching, its nose flaring as it drew in her scent again. Arya could feel the subtle shift in its energy. It was no longer a wild creature trapped by fear. It was something open, searching, trying to understand her as much as she understood it. Behind her, the cadets stood, frozen, their faces pale and wide-eyed. One of them mouthed something that looked like disbelief. Another gripped his sleeve so tightly his knuckles turned white. The instructor, however, did not interfere. He had spent years studying animal behavior, yet he had never seen this kind of silent communication between human and predator. No commands, no training aids, no protective barriers, only calm intention and unspoken respect. He scribbled something hastily on his clipboard, though his hand trembled slightly. His instincts told him this was something he would teach for years to come. The cub took a step closer, so close that Arya could see the individual strands of fur, shining like threads of sunlight. She felt its warm breath against her arm, faint but real. She did not move, her every muscle remained still, her breathing soft and even. The cub sniffed the air near her hand, its ears twitching, its body tense with uncertainty, and yet it did not retreat. Its nose brushed her sleeve lightly, a fleeting contact but enough to send a wave of awe through every witness behind. Arya smiled, a small patient smile. Not of triumph, but of connection. She whispered, a soft hum low in her throat, almost like a purr, a vibration that resonated with calm, and the cub froze its head, tilted, listening. It made a faint, chuffing sound in response, a mimic of her tone. The two sounds merged softly into the still air. The cadets gasped, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The cub's posture changed. Again its tail dropped to the ground, its shoulders relaxed, it sat down with a quiet thump, its eyes no longer wide with alarm but steady, almost trusting. Arya let out a slow breath and straightened her back, just a little, enough to mark the balance between respect and presence. She did not reach to touch it, though every instinct urged her to. She knew the moment was too delicate, too sacred for sudden contact. The Instructor stepped forward to cautious paces, his voice a whisper saying, "Enough. Arya, that's enough." But Arya barely heard him. She was lost in the quiet bond that had formed in front of everyone. A bond carved, not by force, but by understanding. The cub blinked slowly, a final gesture of calm before turning its head toward the sound of birds beyond the fence, and in that still second before the world moved again, Arya knew she had earned something far greater than control. She had earned the trust of the wild itself. The camp seemed suspended between two heartbeats, as if the earth itself had paused to witness what had just taken place. The cub sat before Arya, calm and alert, its golden fur catching the sun in soft waves. The cadets stood frozen, unable to speak, their eyes wide with awe. Even the instructor, who had seen more field encounters than anyone else, could only stare, his clipboard hanging loosely at his side. The world felt strangely smaller now, contained within that circle of dust where human and beasts met without fear or command, only quiet recognition. Arya slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting the cub's once more. Its pupils widened, its breath steady and slow. She could see her own reflection glimmering faintly in those amber eyes, and for a brief moment she wondered what it saw in her, perhaps the same confusion. She felt the same spark of wonder. It was a moment that stretched beyond words, beyond thought, a moment where instinct became language and silence became trust. The cub let out a soft sound deep in its throat, not a growl, not quite a purr, something in between, a note of curiosity, maybe approval. It leaned slightly forward, its nose twitching, catching her scent again. Arya's hand trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. She did not reach out. She knew enough to let the creature make the choice. The cub blinked once, then twice, its whiskers quivering as it studied her. And then it did something no one expected. It nudged its nose gently against her knee, the touch so light it could have been a breath. The gasp that rippled through the cadets broke the still air, a wave of disbelief and wonder. The instructor lifted his hand for silence, though no one dared make a sound. Arya's eyes softened, her lips parting in a small exhale of relief and astonishment. She felt the warmth of the cub's breath against her skin, the faint tremor of its body as it shifted its weight closer. Her heart raced, but not with fear. It was something else, something ancient and pure, a recognition that they had crossed the boundary between danger and understanding. The cub tilted its head, pressing again, just slightly before sitting down beside her. Its fur brushed against the fabric of her uniform, light as dust and yet real enough to make her breath catch. The instructor whispered something under his breath, perhaps a prayer, perhaps disbelief. The cadets exchanged glances, their minds racing to make sense of the impossible. They had trained to face aggression, to manage fear, but not for this, not for the language of stillness and grace that they had just seen. Arya looked down at the cub, her eyes shining with something quiet and powerful. She did not smile, she simply breathed and let the moment exist. The cub yawned softly, revealing sharp young teeth, but there was no threat in the gesture, only comfort. Its tail flicked once across the sand, tracing a small arc like a signature on the earth. The instructor finally spoke, his voice hoarse with restrained emotion. He told them all to remember this moment, that fear and respect could never live in the same heart. That to earn the trust of the wild one must first learn to listen, not to command, but to understand. His words drifted through the group like wind through dry grass. Arya remained still for a long while after the cub settled beside her. She could feel the rhythm of its breathing, the warmth of its small body, a pulse that echoed her own, and as the camp began to stir once more, she realized that the bond they had forged in silence spoke louder than any roar could ever do. The cub sat close to Arya, its golden fur shimmering beneath the midday light, its tail curling softly around its paws. The camp was so quiet that the sound of its breathing could be heard, faint and steady. The cadets stood as if rooted to the ground, too afraid to move, too afraid to break whatever invisible thread held the scene together. The instructor lowered his clipboard slowly, his eyes filled with something between disbelief and admiration. This was not a moment that could be planned or repeated. It was the wild choosing to trust, and no human training could ever command. The Tarya remained perfectly still, her heartbeat slow, and even she could feel the warmth of the cub beside her, a living pulse of nature, a reminder that power did not always roar. Sometimes it simply breathed softly and waited. Her gaze never left the cub's. It blinked slowly, then turned its head toward her hand, its nose twitching. As it studied the faint scent of human skin, she let her fingers relax, not reaching, not inviting, only existing, open and calm, a silent permission for the cub to decide. The cub leaned forward, sniffing cautiously, the space between them shrinking too. Nothing. Its whiskers brushed against her knuckles, light as silk. Its body trembled faintly, not from fear, but uncertainty. It let out a small chuffing sound, low and short, then another, a soft vibration that rose from its chest. Arya answered with a sound of her own, a quiet hum, deep and even, the tone of reassurance her father used when soothing restless animals back on the farm. The cub's ears twitched, it listened, its head tilted, then it answered again, the sound almost playful. The cadets exchanged wide-eyed glances. One of them whispered that this could not be real, another simply nodded, unable to speak. The instructor took a small step closer, his boots crunching softly on the sand. The cub's ears flicked at the noise, but it did not retreat. Its focus stayed on Arya, the rhythm of their breathing matching, as if synchronized by something unseen. Arya smiled slightly, not of pride but of peace. She could feel the energy between them shift, like the tide pulling gently toward connection, rather than conflict. The cub's tail flicked lazily across the ground, drawing soft lines in the dust. Its muscles relaxed, its body language open and trusting. It gave one last curious sniff at her hand, before pressing its nose against her wrist, a gentle nudge that felt like the world itself exhaling around her. The camp released its collective breath, a wave of murmurs rising among the cadets. Half disbelief, half wonder. Arya did not move. She whispered softly words that carried no meaning, but every emotion, calm, steady, kind. The cub blinked, its amber eyes half closing in contentment. It gave a small sigh, and lowered its body to the ground, lying down beside her, its head resting near her. Boot. The moment felt timeless, like something sacred carved from silence and sunlight. The instructor wiped a hand across his brow, muttering that he had seen things in the wild that defied logic, but never anything like this. He told the cadets quietly to remember what they were witnessing, that this was not about taming the wild but understanding it. Arya's gaze softened. She looked at the cub resting so peacefully by her side, and she felt a surge of gratitude, not for her courage but for its trust. The cub stretched its front paws, yawned, and made a soft noise that sounded almost like a sigh before closing its eyes, its breathing even and slow. Arya stayed still, watching over it as if guarding something fragile and irreplaceable around them. The world began to move again. The wind rustled the trees, the birds called from afar, and yet for everyone who stood there, nothing felt the same. For they had seen what few ever would, the moment the wild decided not to fear. The afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the sky with soft shades of amber and rose. The training camp had fallen into a quiet hum, the kind that comes after something sacred has taken place. The cub still lay beside Arya, its breathing slow, its body curled comfortably against the sand. The cadets stood in a loose circle around them, whispering to each other in disbelief, their earlier fear replaced by something gentler, something closer to reverence. The instructor watched in silence, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes thoughtful as though he was memorizing every detail to carry it with him for years to come. Arya sat still, her shadow stretching long behind her. As the light changed, she could feel the rhythm of the cub's heartbeat, faint through the ground beneath her, every beat steady, calm, trusting. She had never imagined that the wild could speak in silence, that it could choose peace when offered kindness. Her thoughts wandered to the farm, where she grew up, to the nights when she would sit by restless horses and hum until they stilled. The memory felt alive in this moment, as though it had prepared her for this meeting between two creatures who spoke only through presence. The instructor finally stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the ground, his voice low but firm, calling out to the cadets, telling them to take note, not just with their eyes but with their understanding. He said this was not about dominance or control, it was about connection, the kind that defied textbooks and broke through instinct with compassion. The cadets nodded in silence, still watching the girl and the cub, as if afraid to blink and miss something magical. The cub stirred, lifting its head, its eyes opening halfway. It looked up at Arya, then at the instructor and the others, its gaze calm and unthreatened. It gave a low huff of sound, then stood stretching its legs slowly. It shook off the dust from its fur and turned in a small circle before settling once more beside her, its flank brushing lightly against her boot, as if marking her as familiar. The air filled with warmth, unspoken but shared by everyone present. Arya smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came not from victory but from understanding. She whispered softly, though her words carried no meaning, only tone, gentle, and even the cub's ears twitched toward her. It blinked, slowly once, twice, then lowered its head to the ground, its body completely relaxed. The camp that had once been filled with nervous energy now felt peaceful. The cadets let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. Some of them even smiled. One muttered under his breath that he would never forget this day. The instructor turned toward the group, his expression solemn but proud. He told them that they had witnessed something few people ever did, the meeting of courage and instinct, the proof that respect could tame fear better than any command. He said that the wild was never meant to be conquered, only understood, and that perhaps the world would be gentler if humans learned that truth. As the sun slipped behind the distant ridge, and the light turned soft and golden, the cub stood once more, its tail flicking lazily, before it began to walk back toward the far end of the enclosure. It turned once to look at Arya, a final glance that lingered just long enough to say what no words could. Then it disappeared into the tall grass. The camp remained still for a long time before the instructor quietly dismissed them one by one. The cadets left, whispering in awe. Arya stayed behind for a moment, her eyes on the grass, where the cub had vanished, and she smiled softly, knowing she had not tamed the wild, but met it halfway.